Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The modern international order centers on two basic principles: the sanctity of sovereign borders and self-determination. In this regard, the Kurdish question is particularly vexing and even dangerous. Will some 30 million Kurds ever have either? Cross-talking Kurdish independence, I'm joined by my guest, Mohammed Marandi in Beirut. He's an associate professor at the University of Tehran. Also in Beirut, we have Martin Jay. He is a freelance broadcast journalist. And in Erbil, we cross to Hiwa Osman. He's an analyst and commentator on Iraq and Kurdistan. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Mohammed, let me go to you first in Beirut. I said in my introduction the issue of Kurdish independence is very vexing and even dangerous. We have a lot of countries in the neighborhood that are staunchly against the idea. But then again, the Kurds, by any definition of self-determination, probably should get their own state here. This is being stuck between a rock and a hard place. Go ahead, Mohammed, in Beirut.
I think a key point that has to be remembered is that the current Iraqi constitution was written with the cooperation of the different groups in Iraq, including the current Kurdish leadership in Erbil. And the constitution accepts a federal Iraq, and the leadership that these people right now have in Erbil is based on that constitution. They supported the constitution, they voted for the constitution, and they helped write the constitution. So this is a key point. The constitution does not allow for just someone to decide to have a referendum and remove parts of the country based on their own beliefs or their own idea that they must have a separate state. In addition, Mr. Barzani himself, he has his term in office ended in 2015. The current Kurdish parliament has more or less been dissolved for the last couple of years, and the Speaker of the Parliament is in effective exile. And even the vote that they had was not valid because only the government faction, or Mr. Barzani's faction, was in Parliament, and there were not enough MPs there. Mm-hmm. There were many irregularities. There weren't any credible observers. But the point is that there are differences across the region. Sure. And if tomorrow some tribe in Saudi Arabia wants to switch sides and become a part of Iraq, or a tribe in Iraq wants to join Syria, then we're going to have a never-ending game of misery.
And this is why I introduced the program. I'll go to Martin Jay here. Is that if we do look at the sanctity of borders and self-determination, they're not mutually inclusive here, Martin. But the fact is that there are political facts on the ground in Kurdistan, in Iraq. We do know that there are factions side of Syria and also of Iran, and this is what everyone's worried about here, is this cascade effect. But to go back to what Professor Marandi had to say in Beirut, Iraq has the constitution it has today because it was illegally invaded and occupied by the United States and its allies, and that constitution was not solely written by Iraqis. Go ahead, Martin, in Beirut.
Well, I think perhaps the borders now, which are drawn up in the middle of the First World War, are probably starting to look a bit frayed and a bit out of date. I think what we're looking at now, I think, is a certain crisis that's evolved in the last few days, and Mr. Barzani must be looking now towards America and the West and realizing that he's been duped, and that maybe promises or assurances that he was given in the last few years when he was fighting for the cause to smash terrorism, both in Kurdistan and other Kurdish groups in Syria, which of course are apart from his groups. The Americans must have been making some sort of promises, some sort of assurances along the lines of, look, we'll look at your independence thing, but first of all, let's get this terrorism fight out of the way. And I think, my opinion is that this issue is not really about borders or constitutions. This is about promises made by the West. And I think that Barzani has probably bitten off more than he can chew. And that's the reason why we've got this crisis situation now.
Okay, Hiwa, if I can go to Erbil, what's really interesting, the kind of crisis is developing from a Western perspective at least, is that you have nominally two American allies, Kurdistan and Iraq, okay, collectively one country but two different groups of people here, and making promises to both. This is what happens when you make promises to two different parties that don't necessarily get along. Go ahead.
Well, to start off with, I would just like to respond to the point about the Constitution. The Constitution says very clearly that Iraq is a voluntary union between the Kurds, Arabs, and the others. And the application of this Constitution is the guarantor of the territorial integrity of Iraq. This is clearly stated in the preamble of the Constitution. The word referendum is mentioned 3 times in the Constitution for other issues, so the act of referendum is not illegal per se. There are different interpretations. When the Constitution was written back in 2005, Kurds, Arabs, Shiites, Sunnis, all parties took part, but the Sunni Arabs boycotted it. Effectively, it was a Kurdish Arab Shia agreement, and then had it not been for the Kurdish vote, the constitution would have collapsed. The subsequent years proved that this constitution is not practical, it's not applicable. Baghdad had its own interpretation. Erbil had its own interpretation. So as a result, this attempted partnership to govern Iraq has miserably failed, and this was mostly during the time of the previous government, of Maliki's government. Salaries were cut, the issue of oil was not clear, who should control what and who should export what. So all of these issues have brought us to this day. When the issue of the referendum was put forward by the Kurdish leadership, Kurds were split into 2 camps, and unlike what your guest from Beirut is saying, Mr. Mohammed is saying, the Kurds were united on the day of referendum. 92% of the voters said yes. The leaders of all political parties, including the change movement, that were in the opposition, that were against the referendum, went for the yes vote because as a result of the actions of Baghdad.
Exactly
the last week.
Hang on here. Let me go back to Mohammed in Beirut. This is exactly what I'm getting at, Mohammed, is that I agree with you on the Constitution. I agree with all of you about the legality or illegality of this vote here and whether it should be recognized. But the fact of the matter is that there are facts on the ground. And this is what the Kurds are reacting to. Also, we see the coming end of the war in Syria. Also, the Kurds played a crucial role, one way or another, and we could talk about that another time. I mean, this is decision time. They see this as a window of opportunity. And we had Chuck Schumer, a U.S. Senator. I didn't know he ever talked about Syria very much, that the independence should be granted to Kurdistan. Well, I know why, and we'll talk about it later, and that word is Israel. But go ahead, Mohammed.
Yes, well, effectively what your good guest has said is reinforcing what I said. In fact, if anyone should complain about the Constitution, it's the Sunni Arabs, not the Kurds, because they had more than their share of representation when writing the Constitution. And if every time a person or a country or an organization wants to pull out of an agreement that they make, then this world is going to be a much more messy place than it is today. It sounds very much like what we see Trump doing nowadays, where he pulls out of the Paris Accord, where he wants to pull out of the JCPOA, and whenever you don't like something, then you're no longer a part of it. That's not something that will work. And the facts on the ground is that the Iraqi the country of Iraq has a constitution, it has a parliament, it has a government, and there are neighboring countries too that are forced to abide by the will of Baghdad. That is the law. If the Iranians are not in a position to go against the Iraqi constitution, if Baghdad says you are not allowed to have flights come into Iraq without our authority, then the Iranians will not do that. And I think our friends in Kurdish Iraq should remember that when Saddam Hussein, the very Americans who are secretly supporting this disintegration of Iraq, along with the Israelis, they should remember that when the Americans were supporting Saddam Hussein and giving him chemical weapons. And during the Anfal operation after the 2001 war with Iraq, the Americans allowed Saddam Hussein to use his helicopters and take back territory, where 2 million Iraqi Kurds went to Iran, and Iran allowed all of them into the country. And also, when ISIS, Barzani, we all remember, when ISIS attacked and took Mosul, Barzani did nothing.
Yep.
And, but when ISIS attacked Erbil, when the Americans refused to help, and Barzani asked them 5 times to help, and the city was on the verge of falling, the Iranians, when Mr. Barzani asked the Iranians for help, they immediately came in. And General Soleimani himself personally went to Erbil to lead the defense against ISIS.
Let me go to Martin here before we go to the break here. Martin, I mean, the real crux of the story is that what happened, if you look at the major Kurdish populations, they're all very key to this. If Assad makes a deal on some kind of regional autonomy, that sends a signal to others in the Kurdish diaspora that some kind of deal can be made. This is why I call this the Kurdish puzzle, this program here. Go ahead, before we go to the break here, Martin.
The point about Assad is an interesting one. He's just recently reached out to the Kurds in northern Syria, and I think this is as a consequence to what's going on in neighboring Kurdistan. You know, it makes him look as though he's more in control of his own country if he can be the one who brokers such a deal. But that's a very dangerous precedent, and I think that's what's making the Iranians very nervous at the moment, is that if we go ahead with these deals and we throw away constitutions and agreements that have been made in history, you know, that does start a very dangerous precedent that we should be very wary of, because we're only going to be looking at increasing.
Martin, I got to jump in here. I have to go to a hard break, gentlemen. After that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the Kurds. Stay with RT.
Most people think to stand out in this business, you need to be the first one on top of the story, or the person with the loudest voice, or the biggest ratings. In truth, to stand out in the news business, you just need to ask the right questions and demand the right answers. Question more.
In America, a college degree requires a great deal. Paying a decades-long debt, studying so hard it requires drugs, going through humiliation to enter an elite society, and partying to death, sometimes quite literally. What are the true colors of universities in the US?
About your sudden passing, I've only just learned. You wore yourself thin, taking your last wrong turn. Your act got up to you as we all knew it would. I'd tell you I'm sorry, if only I could. So I write these last words in hopes to put to rest these things that I never got off my chest. I remember when we first met, my life turned on each breath. But then my feelings started to change. You talked about war like it was a game. Still, some were fond of you, those that didn't like to question or argue. And I secretly promised to never be like you. It's said one does not leave a funeral the same as one enters. The mind gets consumed with death, but this one quite differs. I speak to you now because there were no other takers. To proclaim that mainstream media has met its maker.
Right now we're in Culiacan, capital of Sinaloa in Mexico. And this is a very special place.
A los días me dura el marido unos días, unos meses o unos años y ya se muere.
According to the CIA, it is home to the world's most powerful drug syndicate.
Why you grow marijuana and not tomatoes, let's say?
Y aquí, pues, usted sabe bien que, pues, de comprar un kilo de tomate, mejor te compran un puño de marihuana.
La mafia es dura. te da y te quita.
Most times, the government knows what they do, and they do nothing.
Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter LaBelle. To remind you, we're discussing Kurdish independence. Okay, I'd like to go back to Erbil. It's very interesting to me. I mentioned Senator Chuck Schumer. He's the leader of the Democrats in the U.S. Senate, a very powerful figure. We had during the campaign, Donald Trump's people were making some sounds about supporting Kurdish independence. Okay, now the administration seems to be waffling at this point. Russia has come out saying that it respects the territorial integrity of Iraq. It does not believe, it doesn't support secessionist movements. And then you have Turkey here. Now, the U.S. is sending mixed signals. The Turks are certainly not sending any mixed signals here. This, again, is part of the puzzle here. You have a very strange array of forces right here. Do the Kurds have any chance whatsoever? Because it seems like the entire neighborhood would stamp them out, and it could be very real. A very real military conflict could occur. Go ahead, in Erbil.
Look, the real problem is, I think America has been saying mixed signals.
Yeah.
One day it says we are against. The day after the referendum, it said that we will still deal with Iraqi Kurdistan and with KRG. The real problem here is the neighbors. I think, as your guest from Iran said, Mr. Mohammed, he said that 2 million Kurds went to Iran. The question now, I think, lies with them. Do they want another 2 million Kurds to, again, at this time of the Middle East, to go to Turkey and to Iran? Or mostly, I think they will go to Turkey, for that matter, if military action has started against Iraqi Kurdistan, just for going to the ballots and saying yes or no. I think there is an unjustified fear of that vote. The vote is, although it says it is for an independent Kurdistan, it should be seen as a vote to say no to the way Iraq has been governed. Iraq has proved that over the past 100 years, the only way to hold it together is with iron and fire, and with chemical weapons and with dictatorship. A country like this cannot continue forever, and the people of Iraqi Kurdistan have opted for another option. They are now saying, we do not want to be part of this. I think the ball is now in the Iraqi governments and in Baghdad's court to say, okay, where do we take it from there? We're still neighbors, when even if this area of land becomes independent, it's not going to be taken away from the region. We will still be neighbors with Iran, with Turkey. The real problem with Iran and Turkey is that their own Kurds have zero rights in their countries. The absolute minimum basic human rights, rights of equality, rights of citizenship do not exist at all. Their sheer existence as Kurds is denied, and this is exactly why they are very nervous about any presence, any Kurdish entity in Iraqi Kurdistan. In 2003, practically Iraqi Kurdistan was independent, and
yes,
when the Americans came and toppled the regime of Saddam Hussein, they went to Baghdad and they tried to make this new country work. 13 years later, it is clear now that this is not working, and one of the most dysfunctional places on earth is Iraq today.
Okay.
And a group like ISIS
I want to ask all three of you probably the most difficult question to be posed on this issue here. Martin, I'll go to you first here. What is the solution? Is there a solution? Because, again, as I started out the program, I think all of us believe in self-determination. That's why I keep it, because I'm bringing up the friction. I mean, this is an obvious friction point here. We just heard from our colleague in Erbil. I mean, how do you address that? Where's the justice, as many people would say? Go ahead, Martin.
Look, the referendum on its own isn't the be-all and end-all. I mean, it's just one step, it's one signal. I don't actually believe necessarily that Barzani really wants to go the full 9 yards and even take full independence, because I think the price is just going to be too high for him.
Yeah.
You know, the solution really is a diplomatic one. I mean, this week he's just reached out to the Erdogan government in Ankara because he wants to start talks, he wants to improve relations and make amends. I think that's a really positive and very clever thing to do. A smarter thing to have done might have been to have done that much earlier on, because in the last 2 years, since 2015, relations between Barzani and Erdogan's government have frayed somewhat. But listen, the solution is a diplomatic one. You have to engage Iran, Baghdad, Iraq, and the Turks. We basically need the Russians to come in and create an Astana 2 or an Astana 3. You know, these people have got to get around the table and look at the core issue. And really, the truth of the matter is, the core issue is money. The core issue is that the Kurdistan regional government is having real financial trouble. It's got $20 billion in debt. It hasn't paid a lot of its teachers and civil servants fully in the last few years. And it needs a rescue plan of some sort. And the rescue for them, for Barzani, is Kirkuk's oil fields. And that's what really is the heart of this matter, in my opinion.
Mohammed, let me go to you. I mean, as we see Western-backed proxy forces dwindling in Syria, and it looks like there's the ray of hope that the Damascus will prevail over all of Syria eventually. But then again, there's a lot of Kurds right there. Could a compromise about regional autonomy inside of Syria be an example for what maybe Iraq could do, staying within the constitution and maintaining the sovereign borders? That is, if it's a big proviso, if the Turks will leave Syria. Go ahead.
Well, it's too early to say, and again, that's something that the Syrians themselves have to decide. If the Syrians make a decision themselves, then Iran or no other country really are in a position to say otherwise. With regards to what your guest in Arabil said, again, when he says that the Kurds in Iran or Turkey have absolutely no rights, and when he speaks like that, it really makes it no longer an argument, because it sounds more like propaganda. I think he knows quite well that that's not really the case, so I don't really want to go there. But I do want to point out.
Well, I'll let you reply. Let Mohammed finish, and I will let you reply. I will let you reply. Go ahead.
When we look at Iraqi Kurdistan right now, there is no democracy. Barzani is the dictator in Erbil. He was supposed to step down 2 years ago. The parliament has not been an effective parliament. It's been basically disillusioned more or less for the last 2 years. We have militant forces, more so than Kurdish Iraq. When we look at the Kurdish areas, we see armed forces, different armed forces controlled by different people. Barzani has his own troops. We have the PKK. We have in Soleimaniye, Talibanese forces. These are different forces, and they're very hostile towards one another. The Goran Party, the Talibani Party, none of them accept the way in which Barzani is behaving. Let's look at Sudan. When the Americans for a very long time supported the breakup of Sudan, and they said that South Sudan is going to be heaven on earth, what happened?
Yep.
Did it end the bloodshed? South Sudan right now is one of the most miserable places on earth. So at the end of the day, the problems in Iraq have to be solved within the framework of the Iraqi constitution, and the parties themselves have to sit down and sort the problem. When people like Netanyahu get involved, especially when ISIS is being defeated, ISIS and other extremist al-Qaeda groups were used by Western powers, regional powers, to destroy this region. And as soon as we see that those are beginning to collapse, those projects, now we see another potential problem on the horizon, where Netanyahu and elements within the United States, or the deep state of the United States, are supporting. So again, Iraq has a constitution. The Kurds, the Arabs, all of them voted upon it, and they have to sort out their problems themselves.
Let me go to Erbil. Do you want to respond to what Mohammed had to say in Beirut? Go ahead.
Well, to be honest, again, I mean, you're saying that I'm making propaganda, but to speak of no democracy in Iraqi Kurdistan and full democracy in Iran, this is very interesting. I think we should, I will leave that there. But one thing I can tell you, the referendum has taken place. We do have a number today that says 92%, that says 92% of the vote of the people have said yes. This picture that you painted of Iraqi Kurdistan with armed forces here and there, let me tell you one thing, if the viewers don't know, all of these forces are now on the front lines fighting ISIS with the Iraqi army. Alongside the Iraqi army, they are together fighting ISIS. The issues of land grab that you are talking about, these are areas that were evacuated by the Iraqi army when ISIS attacked. They were jointly controlled by the Kurdish Peshmerga forces and the Iraqi army during the government of your friend Mr. Maliki, when ISIS came and took over 3 divisions of the Iraqi army, threw their clothes
the Prime Minister is Mr. Al-Abadi.
Went back to their areas. So. No, I'm talking about Maliki. I'm talking about when ISIS attacked, when Maliki was
and we're talking about now and Mr. Al-Abadi.
The 3 divisions of the Iraqi army, when they left these areas. Today, Mr. Al-Abadi is a very wise man. If he is looking for a solution, I can tell you that. But there are people who are upping the ante. They are trying to corner him into a position of war, and there are serious attempts to undermine him by his own people, by parties within the Shiite camp, and they are the ones who are backed by Iran, unfortunately.
All right, let me jump, gentlemen, we're rapidly running out of time. We're rapidly running out of time. I want to go to Martin in Beirut here. Let's go full circle here, Martin. You mentioned Sykes-Picot, which I think is very, very interesting, 101 years ago. Is that unraveling? And for our viewers, that was the French and the British completely rewriting the entire sovereign geography of the Middle East. 101 years old. Is it unraveling? And what does it mean? You got 30 seconds. Sorry, my friend. Go ahead.
I really hope it isn't unraveling. You know, I mean, what we haven't discussed in this show, and I'll just chip in as quickly as I can, is the Israeli threat. You know, Israel is looking now at Kurdistan and is salivating, looking at this country and thinking, can we take this country into our fold? And this is what we need to avoid at all costs, because that would just be a godsend to the Israelis, and that would create further division and further chaos and bloodshed in the Middle East. So let's hope that these people can get around the table and can find a solution soon, because the Israelis really are looking at Kurdistan now and thinking of it as a new frontier.
Well, on that point, I'm glad you mentioned it, Martin, because it's the only country that was actually very much for the referendum vote. Okay, many thanks to my guests in Beirut and in Erbil, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.